Somewhere on a collector's shelf in the West, a small plastic radio is still alive. Turn the dial, and the needle slides across a crowded band. 19 meters, shortwave. The frequencies that once carried voices no Soviet citizen was ever supposed to hear. The radio was built in Riga, stamped in Cyrillic, made by the very same state that spent a fortune trying to erase those signals from the air. Hundreds of jamming towers, night after night, drowning the West in static. Think about that. A government terrified of what its people might hear, handed them the machine to hear it with, mass-produced it, boxed it, sold it, even shipped it abroad for hard currency. The Soviet Union made millions of these receivers: Spidola, Okean, Vega, names that meant something in living rooms from the Baltic to Siberia. And then, almost overnight, the brands vanished. The factories went dark. The empire that built them dissolved into borders. So what actually happened here? Why would a sensor arm its own audience? And where did all those radios and the names on them finally go? Let's tune in. Before we go back to the beginning, take a second to subscribe. This channel is where dead industries get their stories told straight. Because to understand how these radios disappeared, you have to start where it all began. Not in Moscow, but in a factory in Riga, decades before the Cold War. To find the beginning, you have to leave the Soviet Union behind. Because when this story starts, the Soviet Union doesn't own it yet. Go to Riga, the capital of Latvia, in the years between the two world wars. Latvia is a young country then, independent only since 1918, and hungry to prove it belongs among the modern nations of Europe. Its proudest piece of proof takes up an entire city block on the edge of town, a sprawling brick factory with the initials VEF stamped on everything it makes. Valsts Elektrotechniska Fabrika, the State Electrotechnical Factory, and note that name, Latvian, not Russian. Hold on to that. It's going to matter more than you'd think. VEF had humble bones. It began in 1919 as the repair workshops of the Latvian Postal and Telegraph Service, reportedly just 5 mechanics and a handful of tools. But it grew with startling speed. By the 1930s, VEF made more or less anything an electrified society could want: telephones and telephone exchanges, light bulbs, electric irons, flashlights, radios, photographic paper, and, astonishingly for a small Baltic state, even aircraft. By the late 1930s, the factory employed somewhere around 4,000 people. This was not a backwater. This was the industrial pride of an entire nation. And then there was the camera. In 1938, VEF began building the Minox, a sub-miniature camera small enough to hide in a closed fist, by most accounts the smallest in the world at the time. It was a marvel of precision engineering, sold and admired, well beyond Latvia's borders. Remember that too. A machine designed to capture what people weren't meant to see. Decades later, another VEF machine would let people hear what they weren't meant to hear. The factory had a talent for that kind of irony long before it understood it. Here's the part that gets flattened in the retelling. Before 1940, VEF was not a cog in anyone's planned economy. It competed. It sold into open European markets against German and Western firms, and it held its own. On quality, on design, on price. That's a detail worth marking because everything that made VEF formidable in the 1930s was exactly the thing the coming decades would quietly take away from it. Picture an ordinary evening in Riga in those years. A family gathers in a small apartment around a VEF tube radio. A piece of furniture, really, glowing warm in the corner. To own it, they'd have paid for a radio subscription, a license just to have the set in the house. And in the evening, the dial pulls in signals from all over. The station in Riga, then Warsaw, then Berlin, then Moscow, the voices fading in and out on the night air. Radio, in that moment, is a window thrown open on the wider world. Nobody in that room could imagine that within a few years, a government would spend fortunes trying to nail that window shut. Because the world was about to close in on Latvia hard. In 1940, the Soviet Union annexed the country. VEF, the crown jewel of independent Latvian industry, was seized and nationalized overnight. Turned, with the stroke of a decree, from a competitive private enterprise into state property. Then came the war. German forces occupied Riga and put the factory to work for their own purposes. By some accounts, VEF's benches were turned toward tape recorders and military gear under Nazi management. When the war ended and the Red Army returned, VEF was absorbed back into the Soviet system for good, this time permanently. And it wasn't alone. A short distance across Riga stood another radio house that would loom just as large in this story, Radio Tehnika, founded in the 1920s by a Latvian Jewish industrialist named Abrams Leibovitz. It started, as many did, by assembling licensed designs from German firms like Telefunken, then grew into a serious manufacturer in its own right. It too was swallowed, nationalized, reorganized, folded into the machinery of the state. So by the late 1940s, the map is set. Two of the finest radio factories in the entire Soviet Union sit not in Russia at all, but in occupied Riga, staffed by Latvian engineers, carrying Latvian names, building for a Russian-run empire that stretched 11 time zones east. That geography feels like a footnote right now. By the end of this story, it will be the thing that kills them. But here's the retention beat, the part that should stop you. When the Soviet system took over VEF, it didn't gut a failing company. It captured a brilliant one. It inherited world-class engineers, precision tooling, and a reputation for excellence. And it pointed all of that at a single customer, the state. For a while, that would look like a gift. Guaranteed orders, no competition, endless demand from a continent-sized empire. It would take 40 years for anyone to notice that a factory with only one customer isn't safe. It's dependent. And into that captured brilliance, Kospikida and Kuintsmatme, the Cold War was about to drop an impossible assignment, one that would force the Soviet Union to build in enormous numbers, the very thing it most feared its own people getting their hands on. To understand how that happened, we have to go inside a closed-door argument at the very top of the Soviet leadership. An argument about whether to let the Soviet people own a shortwave radio at all. The argument happened behind closed doors, somewhere around 1958, inside the Presidium of the Soviet Central Committee, the small circle of men who ran the whole country. And the question on the table sounds almost absurd when you say it plainly. Should Soviet citizens be allowed to own a shortwave radio at all? The problem was arithmetic. By the late 1950s, roughly 60 foreign stations could be picked up on Soviet soil. Voice of America, the BBC, later Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, all beaming in on shortwave, all speaking to Soviet listeners in their own languages. And shortwave has a property the Kremlin could not repeal. It travels. It bounces off the upper atmosphere and comes down thousands of miles away, indifferent to borders. A Central Committee investigation, by most accounts, found that something like 85% of the country's shortwave sets were concentrated in the Western republics. The very places where, as one official reportedly put it, there was nothing to listen to except enemy radio. So the state did what a police state does. It jammed. It built a wall of noise in the sky, hundreds of transmitters flooding the airwaves with howl and static, and by some estimates as many as 1,400 jamming stations by the early 1960s. It was staggeringly expensive. According to Central Committee officials themselves, jamming cost hundreds of millions of rubles a year, reportedly more than the Soviet Union spent on all of its own domestic and international broadcasting combined. The regime was spending more to block sound than to make it. And here is the retention beat. The moment the leadership backed itself into a corner. In that closed-door debate, someone made the obvious point. If the state stops manufacturing shortwave receivers, people won't simply give up. They'll adapt ordinary radios themselves, solder in a coil, stretch an antenna, and any determined tinkerer can reach the forbidden bands. You cannot uninvent shortwave. You cannot confiscate the sky. Ban the radios, and you don't end the listening. You just lose control of the hardware doing it. So the Kremlin split the difference, and the compromise tells you everything. By some accounts, from 1958, the state pulled back on the highest, most dangerous shortwave bands. The frequencies where Western signals came in strongest by day, quietly leaving them off many domestic sets. Censorship, engineered directly into the circuit board. A radio designed to be a little bit deaf. It was a clever fix. It also barely worked, because a crippled shortwave set is still a shortwave set, and the empire was about to build them by the million. Now bring in the second piece, the technology that made mass ownership possible in the first place. The transistor. The Soviet Union came to it late, trailing the West, but not nearly as far behind as Western collectors would later assume. By most accounts, Soviet labs produced their first point-contact transistors in the early 1950s and moved to junction transistors by the middle and end of the decade. Largely their own work, homegrown, if a step behind. And a transistor radio changes the whole equation. No warm-up, no wall socket, no heavy furniture glowing in the corner. A shortwave receiver could now be small, cheap, battery-powered, and above all, portable. It could go to the dacha. It could go under a blanket. Which brings us at last to the machine itself. In 1960, the VEF factory in Riga began turning out a small run of a new portable receiver. By 1962, it was in full mass production, and it would become the most famous radio the Soviet Union ever built. They called it the Spidola, a name borrowed from Latvian myth. It was the first mass-produced, all-transistor portable in the USSR to carry the shortwave band, and it was genuinely good. The cabinet, a clean slab of thermoplastic, was shaped by a respected Latvian industrial designer named Adolfs Irbaitis, and it looked, frankly, sharper than a lot of what Western Europe was making at the time. But the detail that captures the whole Soviet condition is buried inside. The Spidola ran on 10 transistors, and yet used only 2 types of transistor to do it, 8 of one and 2 of another, plus a couple of diodes. Scarcity turned into a design philosophy. Make the most of the least. Squeeze a world-class product out of a chronically short supply chain. That instinct built the Spidola. It would also, decades later, help sink the entire industry. But we're not there yet. Picture the payoff of all this on an ordinary night. A university student in Moscow, door shut, the Spidola tipped on its side on the desk. Because listeners learned that turning the set, standing it on end, even hanging an antenna wire out the window could pull a signal out of the murk. Late is better. The jammers, by many accounts, ran weakest after dark. So he moves the needle a hair at a time through the hiss, hunting the seam between 2 howling jammers. And then, for 10 seconds, maybe 30, a clean voice breaks through. London, or Washington, or Munich. He leans in, and a machine stamped with a Soviet factory's name delivers him the one thing the Soviet state most wanted to keep out of that room. Multiply that student by tens of millions across 11 time zones, and you start to grasp the scale of what the USSR had set in motion. Because the Spidola was not a one-off. It was the opening note of an industrial symphony. A network of enormous factories spread across the empire that would flood the Soviet world with radios and, in doing so, arm an audience of hundreds of millions. To see just how big that got, And where those factories actually stood, we need to pull back and look at the whole machine. The Soviet Union, for all its factories and all its 5-year plans, had a chronic, humiliating shortage. And it wasn't of steel or grain. It was of hard currency, Western money, dollars, pounds, Deutschmarks. The only kind of money that could buy the things the planned economy couldn't make well. Advanced machinery, technology, the components its own labs kept falling short on. The ruble was worthless outside the bloc, so the state went looking for anything it could sell to the West to bring real money home. And sitting right there on the assembly lines in Riga and Minsk was an answer: radios. So through the 1970s and into the 1980s, by most accounts, the Soviet export machine pushed its receivers out past the empire's edge for the first time. Importers appeared in Britain, the Netherlands, France, Australia, taking in Soviet gear, the Spidola, the Okean, alongside other exportables like Zenit cameras and Lomo optics. The sets were rebadged with Latin lettering instead of Cyrillic, tuned for Western bands, and priced to move. One British advertisement of the era, by some accounts, actually sold the thing on Cold War novelty, pitching an 8-band Soviet shortwave portable as another gold for Russia, a marvel available for barely more than the cost of a cheap single-band transistor. Come marvel at the Soviet miracle, and take one home. Sit with the full absurdity of that for a second, because this is the center of the whole story. Here's a government that spends hundreds of millions of rubles a year jamming Western broadcasts. A government that quietly cripples the shortwave bands on its domestic radios, so its own people can't tune Munich too easily. And that very same government takes the very same class of machine, ships it to London and Paris and Sydney, and sells it to the enemy for spending money. They built the receiver for their own message, and could not stop it from carrying someone else's. That's the paradox that runs under everything. The Soviet state kept trying to control the radio, and the radio kept refusing to be controlled at home, where citizens tipped their Spidolas on end to catch a clean 10 seconds of the BBC, and now abroad, where the same factories that armed a domestic audience were quietly arming the Cold War itself with cheap, capable shortwave sets, just to keep the lights on back home. Picture the other end of that supply line. A Saturday in London, the mid-1970s. A man walks into an electronics shop off the high street, past the Grundigs and the Sonys gleaming in the window, and stops at a squat plastic radio with an unfamiliar name and a price too low to ignore. Spidola. The clerk gives it a little spin. Cold War curiosity, a real Soviet radio, imagine that. And the man carries it home under his arm. That night, in a flat in London, a machine built by the Soviet state pulls in Voice of America clear as a bell. No jammers, no fear, no antenna out the window. The very freedom the Kremlin spent a fortune denying its own citizens came bundled in the box for export at a discount. And now the retention beat, the trap hidden inside the triumph. Look at those exports, and you could tell yourself the Soviet radio industry was competitive. It wasn't just surviving, it was selling in the West, going toe-to-toe with Grundig and Sony. But look closer at how it sold, and the illusion falls apart. These radios moved abroad on price and novelty, cheap, exotic, subsidized by a state that cared more about the incoming dollars than the outgoing margin. There was no service network, no brand anyone trusted, no dealer who'd take one back when the clunky turret band switch started crackling, as it always eventually did. The sets were rugged and clever, real feats of making the most of the least. But they competed the way a curiosity competes, not the way a company competes. The one test that actually decides whether a business can live in an open market. Win the customer on merit against a rival who's trying just as hard. The Soviet radio industry never truly took. It only ever had one guaranteed buyer at home, and one gimmick abroad. For as long as the empire held, that didn't matter. The internal market was a walled garden with 300 million people in it and no competitors allowed. The export dollars were gravy. Every plant had its quota. Every quota had its customer. And the whole vast machine hummed along on the single unspoken assumption underneath all of it, that the empire would always be there, that there would always be an internal market, always be a min radioprom to hand down the plan, always be a captive continent that had to buy Soviet, because it couldn't legally buy anything else. Pull that assumption out, and everything falls. And in the second half of the 1980s, a new man in the Kremlin was about to start pulling. First at the jamming towers, then at the machinery of the party itself, and finally at the seams holding the whole union together. The walled garden was about to lose its walls, and the moment it did, every factory in Riga and Minsk and Berdsk was going to discover, all at once, what it had never once had to learn: how to survive when the customer can finally say no. The long decline starts here. The Soviet Union, for all its factories and all its 5-year plans, had a chronic, humiliating shortage. And it wasn't of steel or grain. It was of hard currency, Western money, dollars, pounds, Deutschmarks, the only kind of money that could buy the things the planned economy couldn't make well. Advanced machinery, technology, the components its own labs kept falling short on. The ruble was worthless outside the bloc, so the state went looking for anything it could sell to the West to bring real money home. And sitting right there on the assembly lines in Riga and Minsk was an answer: radios. So through the 1970s and into the 1980s, by most accounts, the Soviet export machine pushed its receivers out past the empire's edge for the first time. Importers appeared in Britain, the Netherlands, France, Australia, taking in Soviet gear. The Spidola, the Okean, alongside other exportables like Zenit cameras and Lomo optics. The sets were rebadged with Latin lettering instead of Cyrillic, tuned for Western bands and priced to move. One British advertisement of the era, by some accounts, actually sold the thing on Cold War novelty, pitching an 8-band Soviet shortwave portable as another gold for Russia, a marvel available for barely more than the cost of a cheap single-band transistor. Come marvel at the Soviet miracle, and take one home. Sit with the full absurdity of that for a second, because this is the center of the whole story. Here is a government that spends hundreds of millions of rubles a year jamming Western broadcasts. A government that quietly cripples the shortwave bands on its domestic radios, so its own people can't tune Munich too easily. And that very same government takes the very same class of machine, ships it to London and Paris and Sydney, and sells it to the enemy for spending money. They built the receiver for their own message, and could not stop it from carrying someone else's. That's the paradox that runs under everything. The Soviet state kept trying to control the radio, and the radio kept refusing to be controlled. At home, where citizens tipped their Spidolas on end to catch a clean 10 seconds of the BBC, and now abroad, where the same factories that armed a domestic audience were quietly arming the Cold War itself with cheap, capable shortwave sets, just to keep the lights on back home. Picture the other end of that supply line, a Saturday in London, the mid-1970s. A man walks into an electronics shop off the high street, past the Grundigs and the Sonys gleaming in the window, and stops at a squat plastic radio with an unfamiliar name and a price too low to ignore. Spidola. The clerk gives it a little spin. Cold War curiosity, a real Soviet radio, imagine that. And the man carries it home under his arm. That night, in a flat in London, a machine built by the Soviet state pulls in Voice of America clear as a bell, no jammers, no fear, no antenna out the window. The very freedom the Kremlin spent a fortune denying its own citizens came bundled in the box for export at a discount. And now the retention beat, the trap hidden inside the triumph. Look at those exports, and you could tell yourself the Soviet radio industry was competitive. It wasn't just surviving, it was selling in the West, going toe-to-toe with Grundig and Sony. But look closer at how it sold, and the illusion falls apart. These radios moved abroad on price and novelty, cheap, exotic, subsidized by a state that cared more about the incoming dollars than the outgoing margin. There was no service network, no brand anyone trusted, no dealer who'd take one back when the clunky turret band switch started crackling, as it always eventually did. The sets were rugged and clever, real feats of making the most of the least. But they competed the way a curiosity competes, not the way a company competes. The one test that actually decides whether a business can live in an open market. Win the customer on merit against a rival who's trying just as hard. The Soviet radio industry never truly took. It only ever had one guaranteed buyer at home and one gimmick abroad. For as long as the empire held, that didn't matter. The internal market was a walled garden with 300 million people in it and no competitors allowed. The export dollars were gravy. Every plant had its quota. Every quota had its customer. And the whole vast machine hummed along on the single unspoken assumption underneath all of it. That the empire would always be there. That there would always be an internal market. Always be a min radio prom to hand down the plan. Always be a captive continent that had to buy Soviet because it couldn't legally buy anything else. Pull that assumption out, and everything falls. And in the second half of the 1980s, a new man in the Kremlin was about to start pulling, first at the jamming towers, then at the machinery of the party itself, and finally at the seams holding the whole union together. The walled garden was about to lose its walls, and the moment it did, every factory in Riga and Minsk and Berdsk was going to discover all at once what it had never once had to learn: how to survive when the customer can finally say no. The long decline starts here. The man who started pulling was Mikhail Gorbachev, and he began, almost gently, with the sky. For decades, the jamming had been the constant background hum of Soviet life, the wall of static in the upper bands, the fortune spent every year to keep the enemy voices out. Then, in the second half of the 1980s, it started to go quiet. Not all at once, and this is a place the story usually gets wrong. The unjamming came in stages. By most accounts, the Soviet state eased off Voice of America and the BBC first, around 1986 and 1987, as Gorbachev's opening widened. But Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, the stations Moscow hated most, the ones aimed straight at the Soviet republics in their own languages, those it kept jamming the longest. And then, according to the man who ran RFERL's monitoring at the time, it simply stopped. Late one night, reportedly November 21, 1988, the engineers watching the frequencies from a station near Munich saw the jamming against Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty end abruptly, without warning, without announcement. One evening, the wall was there. The next, it was gone. After more than 30 years and untold hundreds of millions of rubles, the Soviet Union quietly stopped fighting the air. Now think about what that did to the radio as an object. For a whole generation, the Spidola on the shelf had been a slightly forbidden thing, a machine you leaned into, tuned in the dark, a little thrill of transgression in every clean 10 seconds of London. Remove the jamming, and you remove the danger. And when you remove the danger, you start, quietly, to remove the point. The shortwave portable had drawn half its magic from the fact that the state didn't want you to have it. The state just stopped minding. The radio was still a good radio. It was no longer a secret one. But that was the small loss. The large one was coming. And it wasn't about frequencies. It was about the map. Because Gorbachev didn't stop at the jamming towers. His reforms pulled at the machinery of the party, and then at the seams holding the Union itself. And in 1991, the seams gave way. The Soviet Union came apart into 15 separate countries. And on August 24, 1991, in the middle of that collapse, the Ministry of Radio Technology, Minradioprom, the Moscow brain that had planned every quota and every shipment for 37 years, was dissolved. The hand that handed down the plan was simply gone. Here is where you have to be precise about what actually killed these factories, because it's easy to name the wrong thing. It's tempting to say the plants died because they lost their military contracts, and they did lose them, catastrophically. VEF, Radiotechnika, Berdsk, all of them had fed the Soviet defense machine alongside the consumer radios, and when the defense orders evaporated in the early 1990s, a huge column of guaranteed revenue vanished overnight. But that's the trigger, not the cause. The gun was already loaded, and the plants had loaded it themselves over 40 years, one guaranteed order at a time. The real cause is the thing I've been circling since the beginning. One customer. These factories had never, not once, had to survive in a market where the buyer could walk away. And now, all at once, the buyer walked away in 3 different directions. Watch the geography do its work, because this is the moment that footnote from the opening becomes the whole story. The Soviet radio industry had been a single supply chain draped across 3 republics, parts and materials and half-finished sets moving between Riga in Latvia, Minsk in Belarus, Berdsk in Russia, all inside one country, one currency, one plan. On the day the Union dissolved, those internal routes became international borders. Overnight, a Latvian factory that had shipped freely to customers in Russia was now a foreign exporter, facing a new frontier, a new currency, tariffs, and a Russian market that was itself imploding. The continent-sized captive audience, the walled garden of 300 million buyers who had to buy Soviet, didn't shrink. It shattered, along lines that ran straight through the middle of the supply chain. And these companies had no muscle for any of it. No sales force, because they'd never sold. No brand loyalty they could bank on, because loyalty is what you build when a customer can choose you. And this customer never could. No service network, no marketing, no instinct for winning anyone over. None of the ordinary survival organs a company grows in an open market, because for 4 decades the state had grown those organs for them, and then the state died. Picture the retention beat as a single, quiet scene. A shift supervisor on the VFI floor in Riga, sometime in 1992. The jamming is over. The great enemy is gone. Independence has come. The thing so many at the factory had genuinely wanted, and by every measure that should have felt like victory. But he's looking down a production line built to feed an empire that no longer exists, holding a plan handed down by a ministry that no longer exists, in a country whose money the old customers can no longer use. He has world-class engineers, decades of expertise, and rugged, clever products, and not one person on Earth who is required to buy them anymore. For the first time in the factory's Soviet life, the question is no longer how many, it's whether any. That was the wound. What happened next? The frantic, doomed scramble to answer that question, the sell-offs, the split-ups, the slow-motion dismantling of some of the finest radio houses in Europe. That was just the bleeding. The bleeding started with a promise that everyone believed and almost no one questioned. The market will fix this. Newly independent Latvia wanted out of the Soviet economy as fast as it could run, and who could blame it? So the government moved quickly to privatize the great state factories, to break them up, sell them off, and let the free market work its magic. The theory was elegant. Private owners, Western partners, real competition. The invisible hand would reward what was good and prune what was dead, and out the other end would come lean, modern companies. The people making these decisions genuinely believed it. Some of them, by most accounts, believed the Western partners who had cheered Latvia's independence would come rushing in to help. They didn't come, and the invisible hand, it turned out, was mostly holding a scalpel. VEF, the crown jewel, the factory that had once employed something like 20,000 people at its peak in 1991, was carved into 6 separate companies. 6. The single most formidable industrial name in the Baltics, chopped into pieces and set loose to sink or swim on its own. And one by one, most of them sank. Cut off from the Russian market, starved of the defense orders, unable to compete with the flood of cheap polished electronics now pouring in from Asia and the West, the fragments failed in sequence. By most accounts, the combined output of Latvia's electronics industry fell by more than 90% between 1993 and 1997. 90% in 4 years. That is not a decline. That is a collapse with a calendar on it. And here's the detail that should stop you cold: the retention beat of the whole downfall. When outside investigators looked at why these companies couldn't compete, the reasons they cited weren't about outdated machines or Soviet technology. They were about poor product quality and poor service. Sit with that. These were factories full of brilliant engineers with decades of hard-won expertise. And the thing that broke them in the open market wasn't that they couldn't build. It was that they had never learned to satisfy a customer. Because in 40 years of Soviet life, no customer had ever needed satisfying. The plan didn't grade you on service. The captive buyer couldn't complain. So the muscle was never there. And when the market finally demanded it, there was nothing to flex. That was the gun they'd loaded themselves all those years, one guaranteed order at a time. Independence didn't destroy VEF. Independence just took away the one condition: a customer with no choice. That had let VEF survive without ever becoming competitive. Trace where the pieces went, and it reads like a slow autopsy. Radiotechnika, the other great Riga house, the maker of the Selga and the Riga series, was pulled through insolvency and reorganization and survived, after a fashion, as a company called Radiotechnika RRR. But listen to what it became. By most accounts, its actual core business today isn't building radios at all. It's renting out real estate, leasing the old factory buildings, most of them long since converted into retail and commercial space. The great anechoic chamber, the audio engineering, the speakers, a shadow of it lingers. But the plant that once helped supply a continent now mostly collects rent on the ground it stands on. Go east, and the story rhymes. Berdsk, in Siberia, the home of Vega, fractured after the union fell into a scatter of successor firms, small design bureaus and workshops carrying pieces of the old name, some still turning out consumer receivers under new labels, none of them the industrial force the Vega Association had once been. Everywhere you look, the same pattern: a mighty Soviet radio house, dissolved into fragments, most of the fragments gone, the survivors clinging to a corner of what they used to be. Picture the listening scene at the end of it. Not a family tuning in the dark this time. A factory floor in Riga, going quiet. The long assembly lines that had turned out Spidolas by the million, still now. The benches empty, the tooling cold. Somewhere in the building, maybe, a last few crates of finished radios waiting for orders that will never come, from a country that no longer exists, in a currency no one will take. The lights go off aisle by aisle. Outside the gates, the flea markets of Riga fill up with used VEF sets. The pride of Soviet industry, laid out on blankets, going for pocket change. Within a few years, the whole vast enterprise would be, in the most literal sense, cleared out. The halls sold, the machines scrapped, the name reduced to a logo on a second-hand radio. By 1999, VEF, founded in 1919, survivor of 2 occupations and a world war, the factory that gave the Soviet Union its most famous radio, was finished. 80 years over. And that is the shape of the fall. Not a dramatic bankruptcy, not a single villain, not a Western competitor who out-innovated them in a fair fight. Just a slow, quiet unwinding. A great industry that had been superbly good at the one thing the old world asked of it, producing, and fatally unprepared for the one thing the new world demanded, competing. The jamming ended and took the radio's secret. The union ended and took the radio's market. And the market that replaced it asked a question these factories had spent 40 years never having to answer, and could not answer now. But a story like this doesn't quite end when the lights go off, because the radios themselves are still out there. And so, strangely, is the ground the factory stood on, now home to something that would make the old censor's head spin. So what does a dead radio industry have to teach anyone still living? Start with the temptation to get sentimental, and then refuse it. It's easy to look at a shelf of old Soviet sets and feel a warm ache. The honest engineering, the rugged little Spidola that still switches on after 60 years, a lost world of leaning into the dark to catch a forbidden voice. That's real, and it's worth remembering. But nostalgia is a trap here, because it points you at the wrong lesson. It tells you these factories died because the old world ended. They didn't. They died because of how they had lived in it. Here's the part that transfers, and it has nothing to do with communism or the Cold War. Every one of these plants had exactly one customer that could never leave. A captive market, guaranteed demand, no rivals. A buyer legally forbidden from shopping anywhere else. And for 40 years, that looked like the safest possible position. No sales pressure, no marketing, no need to win anyone over. But safety and dependence are the same thing wearing 2 different faces. A business that never has to compete, never learns how. It doesn't build the muscles. Quality, under pressure, service, brand, the daily work of earning a choice, because nothing is asking it to. And the day the captive customer is finally free to walk away, all that hidden weakness comes due at once. The protection wasn't strength. It was the absence of the very thing that would have let them survive. That's not a Soviet problem. Ask any company that lived too long inside a single giant client, a regulated monopoly, a subsidy, a protected contract. Anyone whose customer couldn't say no until suddenly they could. The walls that keep competition out also keep competence from ever forming. VEF didn't lose a fair fight. It just discovered too late that it had never been in one. And now the footnote. The twist the old censors would never have believed. Go to Riga today and find the sprawling brick complex where VEF once built radios for an empire. It isn't empty. In 2017, one of the largest technology companies in all of Latvia moved its headquarters into a restored VEF production hall, a firm called MikroTik. And here's what MikroTik makes: routers, networking hardware, the switches and wireless gear that move the modern internet. The machines whose entire purpose is to connect people to information freely across every border on Earth. Read that again. On the exact ground where the Soviet state once manufactured shortwave sets and then spent a fortune jamming the signals they caught, where censorship was quite literally engineered into the circuit board, there now sits a global company whose products exist to route the free flow of information to anyone, anywhere. The building that once served an empire terrified of what its people might hear now ships the plumbing of an open internet to the world. The censors are gone. The connection won. Which brings us back to where we started, to that small plastic radio, still alive on a shelf in the West. Remember it. A Spidola, exported for hard currency decades ago, carried home under someone's arm from a shop in London or Paris. The empire that built it is gone. The ministry that ordered it is gone. The factory that made it is offices and shops now, with a router company where the assembly line used to run. But the radio still works. Turn the dial, and the needle still slides across the shortwave bands. 19 meters, the forbidden frequencies. And the little set does exactly what it was always secretly best at. It listens, and it doesn't care what any government wanted. That was the paradox the Soviet Union could never solve. It built millions of windows and spent a fortune trying to paint them black. And in the end, the windows outlived the painters, sitting quietly on shelves around the world, still able to catch a voice out of the air, long after the state that feared that voice had dissolved into history. The Soviet shortwave brands weren't really forgotten. They were misunderstood. Mistaken for Russian when they were Latvian and Belarusian, mistaken for propaganda tools when they were, in the same breath, escape hatches, mistaken for the safest business in the world, right up until the moment it became the most fragile. They were a machine built to carry one message that could never stop carrying every other. And that, in the end, is the whole story of a state that tried to own the air and lost. Thanks for watching. If this one stuck with you, subscribe. There's a whole graveyard of dead industries with lessons like this one still in them. See you in the next one.